So hey everybody, and welcome back to another week of discussion in Intro to Gender, Sexuality, and Women's Studies. Thank you all for a great couple of weeks of discussion on the Google Classroom board. You all have been bringing in some great examples, great perspective that's really enriched the class conversations as a whole. So thank you for that. So this week we're keeping the momentum going by diving into how we conceptualize sex and gender. So thinking about how the ways that we tend to understand these ideas in culture at large can tend to be very limited. So thinking about how do we expand those ideas in order to make space for recognizing and appreciating a wide range of identities. So to kick us off, we're thinking about some key terms. So first key term we're thinking about is cisgender. So folks may have come, into contact with this particular term before. You might not have. Either way, it's no big deal. We're all learning here. So cisgender refers to folks whose gender aligns with the gender they were assigned at birth. And trans folks' gender does not align with the gender that they were assigned at birth. So in order to understand how, one's gender might not align with the gender that they were assigned at birth, it's important to understand both sex and gender in fluid capacities, so in more expansive capacities as a spectrum. So what does it look like to understand biological sex as a spectrum? So first of all, when we think about biological sex, we tend to understand it in obviously a very binary way. So binary meaning that there's only two options. There's male or female. When in fact, biological sex is made up of a host of sex characteristics that are subject to fluidity. They're subject to change. So it's important in order to appreciate how, fluid biological sex can be. That's going to help ground our understandings of gender. So when we think about biological sex, we're thinking about how biological sex, and we're not getting into, a full-on, bio discussion here, but, just for the sake of, understanding, different folks' identities and experiences, we can say that, biological sex is made up of, hormones, gonads, genitalia, and chromosomes. Those four characteristics tend to refer to, how we understand biological sex. So it raises questions around why we tend to use someone's genitalia as the marker of what particular biological sex that person has, considering, their hormones are subject to change and different variations, different changes and whatnot. Gonads, which would refer to, ovaries and testes and things like that. Some folks are, born without ovaries. Some folks need to have their ovaries removed because of, some kind of medical issue and whatnot. So thinking about if those things are not present, like ovaries or whatnot, how then does that impact our understanding of a person's biological sex? So what this conversation is getting at is that we tend to use the visible criteria of genitalia as the be-all, end-all of somebody's biological sex, when it's much more complicated than that. So thinking about, how when we locate someone's biological sex as being either or, male or female, that, creates a lot of challenges for, thinking about folks that are born, for instance, as intersex. So intersex would refer to, people that are born with some form of, even like ambiguous genitalia. So there's medical procedures that will go underway right away from when that child is born to change their genitalia to look the most like, either or, male or female. As opposed to, potentially letting that child just come of age and, make the decision for themselves how they identify. We can impose that sense of binary on to children right when they're born. So when we assign, either male or female to children right when they're born, we essentially create a roadmap for them of, what sort of gendered experiences they're going to have. So when we say, this child is male, this child is female, we're obviously putting them on a path that is, I like to identify it as being a kind of gendered box that we then ask a child to fit into, where, it's like, you're going to have these particular interests, you're going to be this particular way, you're going to have these particular characteristics, because we've assigned this path to you from the get-go. When, there's a whole host of ways that people can identify their gender that goes beyond male or female. So that's where, we would understand how like trans identities and gender nonconforming identities coming into play, where it's, essentially folks that are pushing back against this binary understanding of gender. And, this all goes to say that, there's nothing wrong with being cisgender. I think that sometimes in culture at large, when people do talk about, gender in expansive ways, sometimes people can get a little nervous that they're being forced to, have a different gender or have, a different form of identification than they're used to. But gender, it's a very personal experience in terms of, how you relate to these different concepts, how you relate to masculinity and femininity, how you relate to neither, how, there's just a host of ways that, you can understand yourself in relation to this. So in order to make these ideas a little bit more clear, I think it's helpful to understand, different cultural examples, or use cultural examples, I should say, as an entry point for thinking more deeply about them. So the first example that's coming to mind is I thought of you all this past weekend because I was doing some research of my own for writing that I'm doing that's about like contemporary wellness culture. And I was watching, because media and cultural studies people, when we're doing research, sometimes that means watching a Netflix show. I was watching the Goop Lab show with Gwyneth Paltrow. And basically, I'm thinking about how white feminism comes into play with contemporary wellness culture, and thinking about, going back to our conversation around white feminism, where, it's this particular kind of ethos that denies intersectionality, that, not only centers white women's voices in narratives, but it also centers cisgender voices, and it doesn't make space for more expansive understandings of gender. So in watching an episode of Gwyneth Paltrow's Goop Lab, I was really struck by this one particular episode that was about women's pleasure. And they were talking about women's pleasure, women's identities, specifically related to their genitalia. So they were saying things like, as we know, all women have vaginas, as we know, like the female experience as someone with a vagina is like this. When now moving through this conversation with me, you can pick up on how that is a very limited understanding of gender, because not everyone that's a woman has a vagina. Not everyone that, has ovaries identifies as a woman. So there's, a whole host of ways that, people can understand their gender and whatnot. And something, like this episode of Gwyneth Paltrow's Goop Lab, it really does work to reinforce those kind of limited understandings of gender. And, a lot of people have been talking about gender reveal parties and just, what they mean, and, the sort of work that they do to reinforce these binary understandings of gender. So now that, we've moved through this discussion, and, we've talked about how biological sex can be understood as fluid, that gender identity as well can be understood as fluid, let's think a little bit about how you all understand gender reveal parties, like what your thoughts are on those, considering gender reveal parties use just a photograph of a child's genitalia or the information about a child's genitalia to then make this big reveal that they are this particular gender based on that child's genitalia, which then creates this somewhat of a roadmap for what that child's experiences are going to be like. And people may have seen in the past, a lot of gender reveal parties are very much like associating particular activities with like what that child is going to like because of an ultrasound picture and because of the genitalia that they have. So I'm curious what your thoughts are on that, and I'm also curious about what folks think about. There's the Dean Spade piece that you're all reading for this week where he talks about pronoun etiquette and asking people for their pronouns, what that looks like. So I'm curious about your reflections on that, and I look forward to talking to you all on the Google Classroom.